Former Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, Ambassador Robert Joseph.
Good evening, Mrs. Rajabi. Thank you very much for the kind invitation to be part of this very impressive and important event. Like you, I start from the conviction that for the mullahs, terror is a way of life. It's been that way from the outset and remains a defining characteristic of the regime. Terror is embedded in the regime's very DNA, and as such, terror is as much a part of the regime's future as it has been in the past. On the international front, Iran is the most brazen of that group of pariah states that have earned the dishonor of being on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. For over 40 years, the regime has conducted hundreds of assassinations and terrorist attacks in more than 40 countries around the world. As others have pointed out, a prominent characteristic or component of the regime's terrorism profile is the use of Quds Force and Ministry of Intelligence officials, as well as diplomatic personnel, who follow the orders of the IRGC and the MOIS, the true power ministries in Tehran. Iranian diplomats have repeatedly been implicated in assassination plots abroad, as evidenced by arrest warrants, judicial and police investigations, intelligence services, and witness reports. This includes in the United States, and is particularly the case in Europe, where recent, potentially large-scale terrorist plots against peaceful groupings of the MEK have been thwarted in Belgium and Albania. And while we need to focus on the regime's use of terror abroad, as you pointed out, Mrs. Rajabi, we also need to acknowledge the mullah's use of terror in oppressing the Iranian people. No one knows this better than you and your colleagues in the MEK, who have suffered and have persevered through tens of thousands of murders committed by the regime's death squads in the 1980s and targeted assassinations inside and outside of Iran continuing today. And here, we must always remember the murderous attacks on the defenseless residents of Camp Ashraf and Camp Liberty in Iraq. And this really goes to my broader point. As part of its very existence, terror will accompany the regime as long as the regime endures. But history teaches us that when terrorism is an essential component of a regime, when terror is inseparable from the regime, when terror becomes necessary for the very survival of the regime, that regime is doomed. This is the paradox that the mullahs face. This is the paradox that they can't escape. So what can be done until the people of Iran achieve their goal of overthrowing the religious dictatorship? Mrs. Rajabi has outlined a comprehensive plan of action. I would just emphasize 3 of those steps. First, we need to start with the very clear-eyed assumption that the regime will continue to employ terrorism to achieve its objectives. This is not a normal country. This seemingly never-ending fantasy that the regime will at some point conform to international norms and practices is just that. It is a fantasy that only encourages the regime to commit more crimes. Instead of engendering outrage when a terrorist act is uncovered on their territory, this fantasy encourages governments to isolate, if not minimize, that act in order to resume business as usual. Second, at the operational level, we need to work closer on law enforcement, intelligence sharing, and political diplomatic initiatives. We need more countries to join the U.S. in the designation of additional institutions beyond the IRGC, and in the imposition of sanctions on individuals, such as done this past May with the former head of the MOIS. When we have evidence that embassies are involved in terrorism, they need to be shut down. There's no second alternative. They need to be shut down. In the Balkans, where Iran is seeking to expand its malign influence, Albania's ejection of the Iranian ambassador is a commendable first move. But to stop the next ambassador from following the next orders from Tehran, the embassies involved in terrorism should be closed, whether in Tirana or Vienna or elsewhere. Third, at the strategic level, the international community needs to make counterterrorism a central element of the maximum pressure campaign, which is designed to deny the mullahs the means to carry out their terrorist agenda. While my country admittedly has a somewhat mixed record in this regard, and here I'm referring to past policies of appeasement, the US record is better than most, with Albania being a prime exception and a great example for others to follow. And here I would personally offer my thank you to the Albanian government and the Albanian people for all that they have done for the cause of freedom in Iran. Today's event is a call to action. If we are to stop the terrorist attacks, the mullahs must know that there are real world consequences. They must know that the price Tehran will pay is greater than the benefit they may gain from their terrorist activities. This is the fundamental principle of deterrence. And if we are to defend against, effectively, the mullahs' agents of terror, we need to see and we need to treat the regime for what it is. Thank you very much.